Story 1. The Shadow in the Trees. The house stood alone at the edge of the forest, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to reach endlessly into the sky. The old, creaking wooden structure had been there for as long as anyone in the nearby town could remember, but it had remained empty for years. It was a place people whispered about, a place they avoided, especially at night. But for Jack Peterson, it was a sanctuary, a refuge from the bustling city life that had driven him to the brink of exhaustion. Jack had moved to the house to escape the chaos of his life. He was a writer, and the noise and distractions of the city had begun to take their toll on his creativity. His agent had suggested he take some time away, find a quiet place to clear his mind, and finish the novel that had been plaguing him for months. When he stumbled upon the listing for the old house online, something about it drew him in. It was cheap, remote, and perfect for what he needed: a place to focus, to find peace, and to write. The first few days in the house were exactly what Jack had hoped for. The silence was almost overwhelming at first, but it soon became comforting. He spent his days writing and his nights sitting on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the gentle breeze that whispered through the trees. It was everything he had wanted. But as the days turned into weeks, Jack began to notice something strange about the forest. The trees, which had once seemed so welcoming, now appeared to be closing in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him, that there was something lurking in the shadows between the trunks. At night, the sounds of the forest grew louder, more menacing. The rustling of the leaves became more frantic, and Jack often thought he heard footsteps just beyond the tree line. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey in hand, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow moving quickly between the trees. He turned his head to get a better look, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. But the feeling of being watched remained. Jack tried to dismiss it as his imagination, a side effect of spending too much time alone in the woods. But the next night, the shadow returned. This time, it was closer. He could see it more clearly: a tall, dark figure moving silently between the trees. Again, when he turned to look, it vanished. Jack's writing began to suffer. The story that had been flowing so smoothly now felt disjointed, his thoughts scattered and fragmented. He couldn't concentrate, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest, once his sanctuary, had become a prison, and the trees seemed to close in on him a little more each day. One night, after a particularly unproductive day, Jack decided he needed to confront whatever was out there. He was tired of feeling afraid in his own home, tired of the paranoia that gnawed at him day and night. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped off the porch and into the forest, determined to prove to himself that there was nothing to fear. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as Jack made his way through the underbrush. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that danced eerily among the trees. He walked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the forest, until the house was nothing but a distant memory. But the further he went, the more oppressive the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like twisted, gnarled hands. The sounds of the night grew louder, more distorted. The rustling leaves now sounded like whispers, and the distant hoot of an owl seemed to echo with a sinister undertone. Just as Jack was about to turn back, he saw it. The shadow, standing motionless between two trees, its form more defined than ever before. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape was vaguely human, but with limbs that were too long, too thin. Its face, or where a face should have been, was nothing but a void, a darkness that seemed to absorb all light. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadow didn't move, but he could feel its eyes, if it had eyes boring into him, watching him with a malevolence that chilled him to the bone. The air around him grew colder, and Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the shadow slowly began to move toward him, gliding silently over the forest floor. Panicking, Jack turned and ran, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly as he stumbled through the underbrush. The forest seemed to come alive around him, the trees closing in, their branches clawing at him as he ran. He could hear the shadow behind him, moving faster now, its presence pressing in on him, suffocating him. By the time Jack burst out of the trees and into the clearing where his house stood, he was gasping for breath, his clothes torn and his skin scratched and bleeding. He slammed the door behind him and locked it, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath, but the feeling of being watched remained. The next few days were a blur. Jack barely left the house, terrified of what lay beyond the tree line. He tried to focus on his writing, but the words wouldn't come. The shadow haunted his every thought, and at night, he could hear it moving outside, circling the house, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. Jack knew he couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever the shadow was, it wasn't going to leave him alone. He packed his bags, intending to leave the next morning, but as the night wore on, he realized he might not make it that long. The shadow was closer than ever, and he could feel its malevolence pressing in on him, suffocating him. In a desperate attempt to escape, Jack grabbed his keys and ran out to his car. The shadow was there, waiting for him, standing at the edge of the forest, its dark form barely visible in the moonlight. Jack ignored it, throwing his bags into the back seat and climbing into the driver's seat. His hands were trembling as he fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life with a deafening sound. He sped down the dirt road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust behind him. The shadow pursued, moving with an unnatural speed, keeping pace with the car as it raced through the darkness. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The trees on either side of the road seemed to blur together, the dark shapes rushing past as Jack pushed the car to its limits. But no matter how fast he went, the shadow was always there, just behind him, its presence a constant oppressive force. It was as if the forest itself was alive, conspiring to trap him, to drag him back into the darkness. Jack's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to escape the nightmare that had consumed his life. But the further he drove, the more hopeless his situation seemed. The road stretched on endlessly, winding through the forest with no sign of civilization, no sign of safety. It was as if he was driving in circles, the same trees passing by over and over again. Just as Jack thought he might lose his mind, he saw something up ahead, a break in the trees, a clearing with a faint light glowing in the distance. He pressed down on the accelerator, the car lurching forward as it sped toward the light. The shadow was still behind him, but the distance between them was growing, the light pulling him closer, offering a glimmer of hope. As Jack burst out of the forest and into the clearing, he saw the source of the light, a small, run-down gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. He pulled into the parking lot, the tires screeching as he brought the car to a halt. For a moment, he just sat there, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes fixed on the shadow, which had stopped at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. Jack stepped out of the car, his legs shaking as he made his way to the gas station. The shadow didn't follow, its dark form blending into the night as it watched him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He pushed open the door to the gas station, the bell above the door jangling loudly in the silence. The inside of the gas station was dimly lit, the shelves lined with dusty cans and faded packaging. An old man stood behind the counter, his eyes widening in surprise as Jack stumbled in, his clothes dirty and torn, his face pale and drawn. "Help me," Jack gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something out there. In the forest." The old man didn't say a word, just stared at Jack with an expression that was a mix of pity and fear. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small worn book, its pages yellowed with age. He placed it on the counter in front of Jack, his hand trembling slightly as he did so. "Read this," the old man said, his voice rough and hoarse. "It's all in there. Everything you need to know." Jack picked up the book, his hand still shaking as he flipped through the pages. The text was faded and difficult to read, but as he scanned the words, a sense of dread settled over him. The book told the story of the forest, of the shadow that lurked within it, a malevolent force that had haunted the land for centuries. According to the book, the shadow was the spirit of a man who had been wronged long ago, his soul twisted and corrupted by hatred and revenge. He had been cursed to wander the forest for all eternity, bound to the trees that had witnessed his suffering. The shadow fed on fear and despair, drawing strength from the emotions of those who ventured too close. Jack's blood ran cold as he read the final passage. The only way to escape the shadow was to leave the forest, to put as much distance between oneself and the trees as possible. But once the shadow had set its sights on someone, it would never stop hunting them, never stop trying to drag them back into the darkness. The old man watched Jack with sad eyes as he finished reading. "You need to leave," he said quietly. "Now, while you still can." Jack nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned and ran back to his car, the book clutched tightly in his hands. The shadow was still there, waiting at the edge of the trees, its dark form barely visible in the gloom. Jack climbed into the car and slammed the door, his hands shaking as he started the engine. He drove away from the gas station, the shadow fading into the distance as he sped down the road. But the sense of dread never left him, the feeling that the shadow was still out there, waiting, watching, biding its time. Jack didn't stop driving until he was miles away, the forest nothing but a distant memory in his rearview mirror. But even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still with him, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when he would let his guard down. The road stretched out before him, long and winding, cutting through desolate fields and barren landscapes. Jack's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds. He couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to rest. The shadow was out there, and it wouldn't give up until it had him. The miles slipped away, the car eating up the distance as Jack drove on through the night. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, but it offered no comfort. The fear gnawed at him, the sense of being hunted, of being watched. He kept glancing at the book lying on the passenger seat, the old, worn pages filled with the terrible history of the shadow and its victims. His mind raced with thoughts of what he had read, the cursed spirit that had once been a man, wronged and twisted by hatred and revenge. The shadow had been bound to the forest, but now it was free, and Jack knew it was coming for him. He could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edges of the light, waiting for him to falter, to slow down. Jack knew he couldn't keep driving forever. He needed a plan, a way to stop the shadow once and for all. But how? The book had offered no solution, only warnings. The shadow fed on fear and despair, growing stronger with each passing moment. If he didn't do something soon, it would overtake him, drag him back to the darkness. His thoughts were interrupted as he noticed a faint light in the distance. As he drew closer, he saw that it was a small, dilapidated motel, the neon sign flickering weakly in the night. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign of civilization he had seen in hours. He needed to rest, to think. Maybe he could find some answers in the book, something he had missed in his panic. Jack pulled into the parking lot, his car coming to a stop with a screech of tires. He grabbed the book and his bag, glancing around nervously as he climbed out of the car. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of rain. The shadow wasn't there, but Jack could feel it, could sense its presence, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The motel was almost empty, only a few cars parked haphazardly in the lot. Jack hurried inside, his footsteps echoing on the cracked linoleum floor. The lobby was small and dimly lit, the walls lined with faded floral wallpaper that had seen better days. A tired-looking man sat behind the counter, his eyes glazed over as he watched a small television set. Jack approached the counter, forcing a smile. "I need a room for the night," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The man barely glanced at him, sliding a key across the counter. "Room 6, he muttered, his attention already back on the television. Jack nodded, grabbing the key and heading down the narrow hallway. The motel was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the television from the lobby. He found room 6 at the end of the hall, the door creaking loudly as he pushed it open. The room was small and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The bed was covered with a threadbare quilt, the wallpaper peeling at the edges. Jack didn't care. He just needed a place to think, a place to figure out his next move. He dropped his bag on the bed and sat down, opening the book once more. The pages were old and brittle, the text faded and difficult to read. He flipped through the book, searching for anything he might have missed, anything that could help him stop the shadow. The more he read, the more hopeless it seemed. The shadow was relentless, a malevolent force that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be stopped. It had consumed countless lives over the centuries, feeding on their fear, their despair, until there was nothing left. But there was something else, something Jack had overlooked in his initial panic. A passage near the end of the book, written in a different hand, as if added by someone else long after the original text had been written. It spoke of a ritual, a way to banish the shadow back to the darkness from which it had come. Jack's heart raced as he read the instructions. It was a dangerous ritual, one that required great strength of will and absolute fearlessness. The shadow would fight back, would do everything in its power to stop the ritual, but if Jack could hold on, if he could push through the fear, he might be able to banish it for good. The ritual required a specific location, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin. The forest where the shadow had been bound was such a place, but there were others, places where terrible events had occurred, where the veil between worlds had been torn. Jack thought back to the gas station, the old man in the book. He had mentioned something about a place, a cursed spot not far from the station, a place where the shadow had been at its strongest. It was a risk, but it was his only hope. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. If he was going to do this, it had to be now, before the shadow grew too strong. Jack grabbed his bag and the book, pausing only to scribble a quick note on the motel's notepad in case he didn't make it back. As he stepped outside, the night air hit him like a wall. The sense of foreboding was stronger than ever, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. The shadow was close, he could feel it, but he couldn't turn back now. He got back in the car and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The road stretched out before him, long and winding, disappearing into the night. Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as he drove toward the spot the old man had mentioned. The road was narrow and overgrown, the trees on either side pressing in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The further Jack drove, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, the air thick with a sense of dread. Finally, he reached the clearing. It was a small, circular patch of land, the trees forming a perfect ring around it. The ground was barren, the earth blackened as if scorched by some great fire. Jack could feel the malevolence radiating from the spot, the air crackling with dark energy. He parked the car at the edge of the clearing and stepped out, the book clutched tightly in his hands. The night was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He began to prepare the ritual, drawing the symbols in the dirt as the book instructed. His hands trembled as he worked, the fear gnawing at him, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. As he completed the final symbol, the air around him grew colder, the wind picking up, whipping through the trees with a howl. Jack could feel the shadow closing in, its presence like a weight on his chest, crushing him, suffocating him. He stepped into the center of the circle and began to recite the incantation from the book. The words were old, in a language Jack didn't understand, but they rolled off his tongue as if he had spoken them 1,000 times before. The wind howled louder, the trees bending and creaking as the shadow descended upon him. Jack could feel its rage, its desperation as it tried to break through the circle, but he kept going, his voice growing stronger with each word. The ground beneath him began to tremble, the earth cracking and splitting as the shadow fought against the ritual. Jack could see it now, a dark, swirling mass just beyond the edge of the circle, its form shifting and writhing as it tried to break free, but Jack didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He pushed through the fear, through the pain, his voice rising above the howling wind, the incantation filling the night air. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the shadow was gone. The wind died down, the night fell silent, and the oppressive weight that had been crushing Jack lifted. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. It was over. The shadow was gone, banished back to the darkness from which it had come. Jack had done it. He sat there for a long time, the cold earth beneath him, the night air cool on his skin. He had survived. He had faced his fear and won. But as he sat there in the silence, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The clearing was too quiet, the night too still. The sense of foreboding hadn't entirely lifted, and Jack realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't over. The shadow was gone, but the darkness remained, lurking just beyond the edges of the light, waiting for the moment when Jack's guard was down. He stood slowly, his body aching, and made his way back to the car. The book lay open on the seat, the pages fluttering in the breeze. Jack reached down to close it, but something stopped him. A feeling, a whisper at the back of his mind. He picked up the book, flipping through the pages once more. There, near the end, was a passage he hadn't seen before, written in the same hand as the ritual. It was a warning, a final note from the one who had written the ritual. "The shadow cannot be destroyed," it read. "It can only be banished, held at bay. But it will return, stronger and more relentless than before. You must be prepared, for the battle is never truly over." Jack stared at the words, his heart sinking. The shadow would return. It was only a matter of time. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. He closed the book and placed it carefully in his bag, a sense of resolve settling over him. He would be ready. The shadow had taken enough lives, caused enough pain. Jack wasn't going to let it win. As he drove away from the clearing, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the world in a soft golden light. The darkness was retreating, but Jack knew it would be back, and when it did, he would be waiting. Jack didn't return to the city. He knew he couldn't, not with the shadow still out there. Instead, he moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long, always keeping one step ahead of the darkness. He continued to write, the words flowing more freely now, his mind sharper, clearer. The fear that had once paralyzed him was now his fuel, driving him forward, giving him the strength to face whatever came next. But the shadow was always there, lurking at the edges of his awareness, waiting for the moment when Jack's guard was down. It would whisper to him in the dead of night, its voice a low, insidious murmur that crept into his thoughts, filling his dreams with nightmares. Jack never stopped fighting, never stopped pushing back against the darkness. But as the years wore on, the battle took its toll. The fear that had once fueled him began to eat away at him, gnawing at his sanity, his strength. He became more paranoid, more withdrawn, always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the shadow to strike. It was a lonely existence, but Jack had made his choice. He would rather live in fear than let the shadow take him, let it drag him back into the darkness, and so he kept moving, kept writing, kept fighting. The shadow was relentless, but so was Jack. He had faced it once and survived. He would face it again and again, for as long as it took. Because Jack knew that in the end, it wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, about making amends for the lives the shadow had taken, for the fear it had spread. Jack had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. The battle was far from over, but Jack was ready. The shadow would return, but it would find that Jack was no longer the frightened man it had once hunted. He was stronger now, more determined. And he wasn't going to let the darkness win. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Jack drove on, the road stretching out before him, endless and uncertain. The shadow was out there waiting, but so was Jack, and when they met again, Jack knew he would be ready. Story 2: The Last Train Home. Sarah Jenkins was no stranger to late nights. Between university classes, assignments, and a part-time job, her days often stretched into the early hours of the morning. But tonight felt different. As she walked through the dimly lit streets toward the train station, a sense of unease gnawed at her. The city felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you instinctively look over your shoulder, expecting something or someone lurking in the shadows. The train station was nearly deserted when she arrived, just past midnight. The flickering fluorescent lights did little to chase away the gloom that clung to the cracked tiles and graffiti-covered walls. Sarah glanced at the electronic board overhead. The last train of the night was due in a few minutes. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and took a seat on a bench, her fingers nervously tapping on the edge of her phone. There were only a handful of other people on the platform. An elderly man sat at the far end, his head bowed as if in sleep. A young couple stood near the entrance, holding hands and talking in hushed tones. A man in a long, dark coat paced slowly back and forth, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the night itself was holding its breath. When the train finally arrived, the sound of its brakes screeching against the tracks echoed eerily through the empty station. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Sarah stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the near empty carriage. The lights inside were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp in the corners. She chose a seat near the middle, placing her backpack beside her. The other passengers boarded quietly, spreading out through the carriage. The elderly man took a seat at the back, still hunched over with his hat pulled low. The young couple sat a few rows ahead, their heads close together. The man in the dark coat settled into a seat at the far end, his back to the rest of the carriage. The train jolted into motion, the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks lulling Sarah into a state of semi-consciousness. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, her eyes fluttering closed as the city lights blurred into streaks of color. But sleep wouldn't come. There was a nagging feeling at the back of her mind, a sense that something was watching her. She opened her eyes and glanced around the carriage. The elderly man was still in his seat, but now he was staring straight at her, his eyes dark and unblinking. The young couple had stopped talking, their heads turned slightly toward her, their expressions unreadable. The man in the dark coat hadn't moved, but she could feel his presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, that she was tired and her mind was playing tricks on her. But the unease only grew stronger. The train was picking up speed, the lights inside flickering erratically. The shadows in the corners seemed to twist and writhe, taking on shapes that made her heart race. Suddenly, the train lurched violently, as if it had hit something on the tracks. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the carriage into darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she was enveloped in the blackness. She could hear the train speeding up, the sound of the wheels on the tracks growing louder, more frantic. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. And then she heard it, a low, rasping whisper, so close it made her jump. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through her. She tried to move, to get up and find another seat, but her body wouldn't cooperate. It was as if she were frozen in place, held there by an unseen force. "Please, help me." The whisper was louder now, coming from right next to her ear. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she turned her head slowly, dreading what she might see. But there was nothing there, just darkness. The lights flickered back on, dim and unsteady, casting eerie shadows that danced across the seats. Sarah glanced around the carriage, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The other passengers were still in their seats, but they seemed different now. The elderly man was hunched over, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The young couple was sitting perfectly still, their eyes wide and glassy. The man in the dark coat hadn't moved, but his presence felt even more oppressive, as if the darkness itself was emanating from him. Sarah tried to stand, but her legs felt like lead. The lights flickered again, and the train jolted violently, throwing her back into her seat. The flickering became more rapid, the darkness coming and going in disorienting bursts. And each time the lights came back on, the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, more menacing. She could feel it now. Something was wrong with this train, something deeply, horrifyingly wrong. The air was thick with a sense of dread, as if the very walls of the carriage were closing in on her. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks was no longer comforting. It was maddening, a relentless, inescapable noise that filled her ears and made her head throb. Sarah's breath quickened as the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and echoing in a chaotic chorus. "Help me. I'm lost. Please." The voices seemed to come from all around her, from the shadows themselves. She clutched the edge of her seat, her knuckles white, as she tried to focus on anything but the mounting terror that threatened to overwhelm her. The carriage felt like it was spinning, the walls closing in, the lights flickering faster and faster. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt, the force of it nearly throwing Sarah from her seat. The lights went out entirely, plunging the carriage into absolute darkness. The whispers stopped, leaving a silence so deep it was deafening. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to adjust to the blackness, her ears straining for any sound, any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just silence and darkness. Then she heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, like a door opening, followed by the soft shuffling of feet on the carpeted floor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the sound was coming closer, moving down the aisle toward her. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel that something was there, something in the dark, coming closer and closer with every agonizing second. The air grew colder, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. A hand cold and clammy brushed against her shoulder, and Sarah screamed, jerking away from the touch. The lights flickered back on for a split second, just long enough for her to see the face inches from hers, a face pale and gaunt, eyes black and hollow, staring at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold, and then the lights went out again. Sarah scrambled out of her seat, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled down the aisle. She could hear the whispers again, louder and more frantic, echoing in her mind, filling her with a terror so deep it made her want to curl up and disappear. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides, thick and suffocating. She groped blindly for something, anything, to hold on to, but the walls of the carriage seemed to close in on her, the floor tilting beneath her feet. And then the lights flickered back on dim, unsteady, but enough to reveal the scene around her. The elderly man was standing in the aisle, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide and unblinking. The young couple was also standing, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions of fear and pain, their mouths open in silent screams. The man in the dark coat was still at the far end of the carriage, but now he was facing her, his face hidden in shadow. But Sarah could feel his eyes on her, could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She turned and ran, her feet pounding on the floor as she made her way to the door at the end of the carriage. She slammed into it with all her weight, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, trapping her inside with whatever horrors lurked in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices, all pleading, all begging for help. Please, save us. Help us. Sarah pounded on the door, screaming for help, but there was no response. The train was moving again, faster than ever, the lights flickering madly. The shadows twisted and writhed around her, taking on shapes that made her stomach churn. She turned back toward the carriage, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The elderly man and the young couple were gone, but the man in the dark coat was still there, standing in the center of the aisle, his gaze fixed on her. He took a step forward, and the lights went out again. In the darkness, Sarah could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer. She pressed herself against the door, her heart pounding in her chest as the footsteps grew louder, echoing in the confined space. A cold breath brushed against her ear, and she felt the icy touch of fingers on her arm. She screamed, jerking away, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The darkness was alive with whispers, with the sound of footsteps, with the sense of something terrible lurking just out of sight. The lights flickered back on, and Sarah saw the man in the dark coat standing right in front of her. His face was still hidden in shadow, but she could see his eyes cold, empty, filled with a malevolence that made her blood run cold. He reached out a hand, and she felt the cold fingers close around her wrist, pulling her toward him. She struggled, but his grip was like iron, unyielding and relentless. Come with us. The whispers said, the voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she fought against the pull of the man's grip. But the darkness was closing in on her, suffocating her, dragging her down into the abyss. With a final desperate scream, Sarah broke free and ran, her feet slipping on the blood-soaked floor as she stumbled back down the aisle. The lights flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, and the whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic. The door at the far end of the carriage was open now, and Sarah threw herself through it, her heart pounding in her chest as she ran into the next carriage. But the scene was the same: blood on the floor, twisted shadows on the walls, and the sense of something dark and terrible lurking just out of sight. She kept running, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind racing as she tried to find a way out. But the train seemed to stretch on forever, an endless series of carriages filled with darkness and whispers. Finally, she reached the last carriage. The door at the end was open, and beyond it, she could see the platform of a station. The train had stopped, the lights inside the carriage flickering weakly. Sarah ran toward the door, her heart pounding with hope. But as she stepped onto the platform, the darkness followed her. The whispers were still there, echoing in her mind, and she could feel the cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned and saw them, the passengers she had left behind, standing on the platform, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to scream. The man in the dark coat was there too, his face finally visible in the dim light. His features were sharp and angular, his skin pale and cold, and his eyes were filled with a darkness that seemed to go on forever. "Come with us," the whispers said, the voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked around for an escape. But the platform was empty, the exit nowhere in sight. The darkness was closing in, the whispers growing louder, and she could feel the cold fingers reaching for her, pulling her back into the abyss. With a final desperate scream, Sarah ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. All she knew was that she had to get away, had to escape the darkness that was chasing her. But no matter how fast she ran, the darkness was always there, just behind her, the whispers echoing in her mind. And as she ran, the world around her seemed to blur and twist, the station fading away until there was nothing left but darkness and the sound of her own ragged breaths. The train was found the next morning, sitting idle on the tracks just outside the city. The doors were open, the carriages empty, and there was no sign of life inside. The authorities who boarded the train found nothing out of the ordinary: no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. But the train was cold, unnaturally cold, as if something had sucked all the warmth from it. Sarah Jenkins was never found. Her belongings were left in her apartment, her phone still on the bench at the station, but there was no trace of her anywhere. The other passengers on the train were also missing, names that appeared on the train's manifest, but with no one to claim them. The train was eventually put back into service, but it was never quite the same. Passengers would report strange occurrences: cold spots, flickering lights, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Some said they saw shadows moving just out of sight, or felt a presence watching them from the dark corners of the carriage. But the train kept running, and the disappearances were forgotten over time. Just another urban legend, a story to scare children on dark nights. But the train was still out there, still moving through the night, carrying with it the lost souls of those who had boarded it on that fateful night. And every now and then, when the night is darkest and the air is still, you might hear at the distant sound of a train horn, the soft whisper of voices in the wind, calling out to those who dare to listen. Story 3. The Forgotten Ones. The cabin in the woods had always been an alluring idea, a place to escape from the stress of city life, to disconnect from the relentless pace of modern existence. For 5 friends, it was the perfect getaway. A weekend away from everything, just the 5 of them, surrounded by nature and nothing else. No phones, no work, just laughter, campfires, and the solace of the forest. The cabin belonged to Eric's family, tucked away deep in the woods of New England, far from the nearest town. It was an old structure, built by Eric's grandfather decades ago, and though it had aged, it was still sturdy, still capable of keeping out the elements. Eric had spent countless summers there as a child, and the place held a certain nostalgia for him. But it had been years since he'd last visited, and the thought of returning with his closest friends filled him with both excitement and a strange sense of foreboding. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, the roads narrowing as they ventured deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. By the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting the forest in shades of orange and red. "Here we are," Eric announced as they pulled up in front of the cabin. The wooden structure stood before them, its exterior weathered but intact, the windows dark and reflective. It looked almost exactly as Eric remembered it, and yet there was something different about it, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Wow, this place is rustic," Megan said as she climbed out of the car, looking up at the cabin with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "It's perfect," Jason said, grabbing his backpack from the trunk. "Just what we need to unwind." "Yeah, no cell service, no Wi-Fi," Lena added with a grin. "We're going to have to actually talk to each other." "Scary thought," Jake joked, nudging Lena as he slung his arm over her shoulder. Eric led the way inside, unlocking the door and pushing it open with a creak. The interior was just as he remembered: wooden floors, a stone fireplace, old furniture covered in dust. The air was thick with the scent of pine and age, a combination that filled him with a strange sense of nostalgia. They spent the first hour or so unpacking and getting settled in, each of them claiming a room in the cabin. The place was bigger than it looked from the outside, with enough space for all five of them to spread out. By the time they finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the cabin bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace they had lit. They gathered around the fire, laughing and sharing stories, the warmth of the flames warding off the chill that had settled over the cabin. It was a perfect evening, the kind they had all been looking forward to. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The laughter grew quieter, the stories less cheerful, and a heavy silence settled over the group. It wasn't just the fatigue from the long drive or the effects of the wine they had been drinking. It was something else, something that seemed to seep into the cabin from the forest outside. Eric was the first to notice it, a faint sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. He frowned, tilting his head to listen more closely. It was a whisper, soft and insidious, like the wind moving through the trees. But the windows were shut tight, and the fire was the only source of light and warmth. "Did you hear that?" he asked, breaking the silence. The others looked at him, confusion on their faces. "Hear what?" Megan asked. That sound," Eric said, his voice trailing off as he listened again. The whisper was gone now, replaced by the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the old cabin. "I don't hear anything," Jason said, shaking his head. "You're probably just tired." "Yeah, it's been a long day," Lena agreed. "We should all get some rest." They nodded in agreement, and one by one, they made their way to their rooms, the fire slowly dying down as they went. Eric was the last to leave, lingering by the hearth for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the shadows that danced on the walls, but there was nothing there, just the flickering flames and the old furniture, silent and still. The night was quiet, the forest outside seemingly holding its breath as the cabin's occupants drifted off to sleep. But Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He lay in bed, staring up at the wooden ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite grasp. It was just a sound, he told himself. The wind, or maybe an animal outside. Nothing to worry about, but as he closed his eyes, the whisper returned, soft and distant, like a voice carried on the breeze. Eric sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He listened intently, but the whisper faded away again, leaving only the sound of his own breathing in the darkness. He got out of bed, moving quietly to the window. He peered out into the night, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. The forest was still, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. There was nothing out there, nothing but the silence and the cold. Eric shook his head, turning away from the window. He was just being paranoid, letting his imagination get the better of him. It had been a long time since he'd been in these woods, and the unfamiliarity was playing tricks on his mind. But as he lay back down, the whisper returned, louder this time, more distinct. It was a voice. He was sure of it, a voice calling out to him from the depths of the forest. Eric's breath caught in his throat as the whisper grew louder, filling his ears with words he couldn't quite understand. It was a language he didn't recognize, the syllables harsh and guttural, like something ancient and forgotten. He sat up again, his heart racing. This wasn't his imagination. There was something out there, something calling to him. He had to know what it was. Eric grabbed his flashlight and slipped on his shoes, moving as quietly as he could to avoid waking the others. He crept down the hallway and out the front door, the cold night air hitting him like a slap in the face. The forest was dark, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels. The whisper was still there, drawing him deeper into the woods. He followed it, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he made his way down the narrow path. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, but he pressed on, driven by a need to know, a need to understand. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as he ventured further into the woods. It was no longer a single voice, but many, all speaking at once, their words blending together in a cacophony of sound. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed through the underbrush, his flashlight flickering as if it were struggling to stay lit. And then he saw it, a clearing in the trees, bathed in the pale light of the moon. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, old and weathered, covered in moss and vines. The whispering voices seemed to emanate from the altar, filling the air with their strange, haunting cadence. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he stepped into the clearing. The air was colder here, the ground hard and unyielding beneath his feet. He approached the altar slowly, his flashlight flickering and then dying completely, plunging him into darkness, but the moonlight was enough to see by, casting long shadows across the clearing as Eric reached out to touch the altar. His fingers brushed against the cold stone, and the whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening now. He pulled his hand back, his heart racing. The air around him seemed to vibrate with the sound, the whispers turning into something more, something darker, more menacing. The voices were no longer just calling to him. They were demanding, commanding, as if they wanted something from him. Eric stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear as the voices grew louder and louder, filling his mind with their demands. He turned to run, but the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like claws to hold him in place, and then the voices stopped. The silence was sudden, complete, as if the world itself had gone mute. Eric stood frozen in place, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he looked around the clearing. The altar was silent now, the air still and cold, but then, from the darkness, came a low, guttural growl. Eric's blood ran cold as he turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows that surrounded him. The growl came again, closer this time, and he saw it, something moving in the darkness, something big, with glowing eyes that stared at him with a hunger that made his stomach churn. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest as the creature stepped into the moonlight. It was huge, its body covered in matted fur, its teeth bared in a snarl that sent a wave of terror through him. Eric turned and ran, his feet pounding on the hard ground as he sprinted back toward the cabin. The creature let out a roar and gave chase, its footsteps heavy and fast as it closed the distance between them. The trees seemed to blur as Eric ran, his lungs burning, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear the creature behind him, its breath hot on his neck, its growls growing louder with each passing second, and then, just as he thought it would catch him, the cabin came into view. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him and leaning against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The others were already awake, their faces pale with fear as they stared at him. "What the hell is going on?" Jason demanded, his voice trembling. "There's something out there," Eric gasped. Something. Something in the woods. The cabin shook as the creature slammed into the door, its roar echoing through the small space. The others screamed, backing away as the door creaked under the force of the impact. "We have to get out of here," Megan cried, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to leave now." But the creature wasn't done. It slammed into the door again, and this time, the wood splintered, cracks spider webbing across the surface. The friends huddled together, their fear palpable as the door finally gave way, and the creature burst into the cabin. It was even bigger up close, its fur matted and filthy, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It bared its teeth, saliva dripping from its maw as it stalked toward them. Eric grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a rusted fire poker, and swung it at the creature. The metal connected with a sickening thud, but the creature barely flinched. It swatted the poker away with a massive paw, sending Eric crashing into the wall. The others screamed, scattering as the creature lunged at them. Megan tripped and fell, her scream cut off as the creature's jaws closed around her leg, dragging her across the floor. "Help me!" She screamed, her fingers clawing at the wooden planks as the creature pulled her closer. Jason grabbed a chair and smashed it over the creature's back, but it was like hitting a brick wall. The creature roared and turned on him, its claws slashing through the air. "Run!" Lena shouted, grabbing Jake's hand and pulling him toward the door. "We have to get out of here." But there was no escape. The creature was too fast, too strong. It caught Jason by the arm and flung him across the room, his body hitting the wall with a sickening crunch. He slumped to the floor, blood pooling around him. Eric struggled to his feet, his vision blurry, his head throbbing. He had to do something, had to stop this thing before it killed them all. He grabbed a piece of the broken chair and charged at the creature. Plunging the wood into its side, the creature roared in pain, its eyes blazing with fury as it turned on Eric. But before it could strike, Lena and Jake managed to pry open the cabin door and escape into the night. The creature hesitated, torn between finishing off Eric and chasing the others. It snarled, baring its teeth, and then, with a final growl, it bolted out of the cabin. Disappearing into the darkness, Eric collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline finally wore off. The cabin was silent now, the only sound the crackling of the dying fire and the shallow breaths of his remaining friends. They had survived, but at what cost? Eric pulled himself to his feet, his body aching with every movement. He looked around the cabin, his heart sinking at the sight of Jason's lifeless body and the bloodstains on the floor. Megan was sobbing, clutching her injured leg as Lena and Jake returned, their faces pale with fear. "We need to leave," Lena said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of these woods." Eric nodded, his mind still reeling from the horror they had just faced. But as he turned to the door, a new sound reached his ears, a soft whisper, barely audible over the crackling fire. He froze, his blood running cold as the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was the same voice he had heard in the woods, the same voice that had led him to the altar. The others heard it too. Their eyes widened in terror as the whispering filled the cabin, coming from all around them, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air they breathed. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. Eric didn't answer. He knew what it was. He knew now what the voices wanted, what they had always wanted. They were the forgotten ones, the souls of those who had been lost in these woods, who had died in this cabin, who had been sacrificed at the altar in the clearing. They were the ones who had been left behind, abandoned to the darkness, and now they wanted company. The cabin shook as the whispering grew louder, the voices rising in a chorus of demands, of anger, of pain. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and the walls seemed to close in around them. "We have to get out of here." Megan screamed, but there was no escape. The door slammed shut, the windows shattered, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, as the friends huddled together, their terror palpable. The air was thick with the scent of death, the floor sticky with blood, and the walls seemed to pulse with life. Eric could feel them now, the forgotten ones pressing in on him, their cold hands reaching out from the darkness, their voices filling his mind with their demands, and then the darkness consumed them. The cabin was silent once more, the fire reduced to embers, the wind howling outside. The friends were gone, their bodies lost to the shadows, their souls claimed by the forgotten ones. The cabin stood alone in the woods, a monument to the darkness that lurked within, a place where the lost souls would forever dwell, waiting for the next group of unwary travelers to stumble into their grasp. And in the distance, the whispering voices carried on the wind, calling out to those who dared to listen, who dared to venture into the heart of the forest. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.